Assalamu alaikum. Kindly like and share this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Kindly support me with Buy Me a Coffee and a Super Thanks. The Geography of the Morisco Expulsion, a quantitative study by Bernard Vincent. Introduction. When the Spanish Crown's Council of State began to debate the possibility of expelling the Moriscos from the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, no one proposed that the measure should apply to the whole minority population at once. Such a step would require enormous resources on account of the large numbers involved. Over 300,000 persons, perhaps 350,000, and their dispersion throughout several of the peninsular kingdoms. Therefore, all parties agreed that the expulsion should proceed in stages, as in fact happened beginning in 1609. The Patriarch Juan de Ribera, in February 1602, was in favor of starting with the Castilians, whom he considered more dangerous and less economically useful than the Valencians. He reiterated this position in September 1608, but other figures close to Philip III preferred to exile the Valencians first of all, since these were nearer than the rest to Barbary and thus better able to make contacts with North Africa. These debates and hesitations reveal the complexity of the Morisco question, which was founded, among other factors, on a very particular geography. Let us recall the broad outlines of a very unequal distribution. The Moriscos were proportionally much more numerous in Aragon than in Castile. In the latter, which had a population of 5 to 6 million at the end of the 16th century, the Moriscos numbered 100,000 or a little more. That is barely 2% of the total. In Aragon, there were close to 200,000 Moriscos living among fewer than 1 million old Christians. Therefore, they constituted almost 1/5 of the Aragonese. And even within Aragonese territory, their density differed from very few in Catalonia, some 5,000 souls in about 15 towns in the Ribera de Ebro region and around the city of Lerida, to the strong concentration along the Ebro River and its tributaries, where they made up 20% of the whole population. Above all, in the Kingdom of Valencia, Moriscos were almost 1/3 of the inhabitants, even though they were notably absent from the populous city of Valencia itself. Differences. The geographic distribution of the Moriscos in Castile was in large part the consequence of the resettlement of Moriscos from Granada, which began in 1569 after the revolt that started in the Alpujarra Mountains, and later extended to Moriscos from almost the entire Kingdom of Granada. Between 80,000 and 90,000 persons were transplanted to a great number of cities and towns in western Andalusia, Extremadura, New and Old Castile, and the Kingdom of Murcia. Some of these places, which include the Campo de Calatrava's 5 towns, Murcia's Ricote Valley, cities like Avila, Segovia, and Guadalajara, towns like Hornachos and Palma del Rio, were already inhabited by Mudejar Antiguos, which means the former Mudejars, as they were called in contemporary documents, descendants of Muslims who had lived there since at least the late 13th century, and often much longer. Therefore, in 1609, the society was very far from believing the saying that todos son uno, they are all as one, widely repeated in the literature, as José María Percival has shown. The Moriscos' contemporaries, from the authorities on down, were perfectly aware of the differences among Aragonese, Valencian, and Granadan, or rather Granadan Castilian Moriscos, and Mudejares Antiguos. They could also distinguish within those groups between Moriscos from Huesca and from Teruel, from the irrigated orchards of Gandia, and from the dry farms of Segorbe, between silk weavers from Pastrana and peasants from the Cordoban countryside, between villagers from Honachos in Extremadura, and others from Villarrubia de los Ojos in La Mancha. The most significant factor was not, in fact, the greater or lesser number of Moriscos to be found in a given town, city, or kingdom. We recall that in 1602, Patriarch Ribera insisted on the different degree of danger that each group represented. Paradoxically, he considered the Moriscos of Castile more fearsome than those of Aragon. We will not analyze his complex arguments here, but simply note that he emphasized the danger represented by the Granadan Castilian Moriscos, who were still suspected 40 years after the fact of following their parents and grandparents in treachery. The Granadans still bore the stigma of the War of the Alpujarras of 1568 to 1570. But other influential figures were more wary of potential communication between Moriscos from Valencia and the North Africans and Ottomans, contact that they felt threatened the integrity of the crown. In the end, all gave great weight to the possibility of conspiracy. This factor, together with sheer numbers, proved decisive in shaping the geography of the expulsion. Stages of the expulsion. The decision to expel all the Moriscos was taken on 4th April 1609, but at first was applied to the Valencians as the most numerous group and the one that lived closest to the coast of the central Maghreb. While preparations for the transfer were being made, its nature remained a well-kept secret. The decree was issued in Valencia on 22nd September of that year, with Philip III declaring, "We have resolved that all Moriscos be removed from this realm and sent to Barbary." This important phrase constitutes a sharp break with the policies and intents of the decrees of 1502 and 1525, which had been directed to the Mudéjars of Castile and Aragon, respectively. In those, a choice was offered between exile and conversion. They further held that those who opted for exile would leave Spain via the Basque country, if they lived in Castile, or via La Coruña in Galicia, if they were from Aragon. That very long journey for residents of Granada in the first instance, or Valencia in the second, meant that both the cost and the difficulty of the journey were greatly increased. It was no easy matter to travel from either the Basque region or Galicia to North Africa. One can conclude from those orders that neither the Catholic monarchs nor later Charles V intended to promote a massive exodus. But in 1609, Philip III had another objective: to banish virtually all the Moriscos. The decree lists the few possible exceptions to North Africa in the swiftest way possible. By now, no one cared about saving the souls of these newly converted apostates. They could go straight to Islamic lands. Italian galleys were summoned from Genoa, Naples, and Palermo to the ports of Los Alfaquis in the Ebro Delta, Denia, and Alicante. Merchant ships gathered at El Grau, the port of Valencia. In principle, the Moriscos therefore had a relatively short journey to their points of embarkation, from Elche or Petrel to Alicante, from Grandia or Tabernas de Valdignia to Denia, from Alcácer or Boniol to Valencia, from Borriol or Fanzara, the longest stretch, to Los Alfaquis. The first convoy, bearing more than 5,000 persons, left Denia on 2nd October and arrived at Oran on 5th October. Some groups of exiles were attacked by tribes from the Oran region, causing alarm among those who had not yet taken ship. By late October, 2 revolts had broken out which lasted about a month. The Viceroy of Valencia, the Marquis of Caracena, was able to announce on 19 December that the expulsion had been accomplished. Almost all the exiles had disembarked either on the Algerian coast of Oran, on Cape Falcon to the west of Oran, and Mazalquivir, which in Arabic is Mers al-Kabir, or near Arziu to the east. All these stages of the Valencian Morisco's exile were depicted in great detail by 4 artists, who in 1612 to 1613 painted 7 pictures commissioned by the Marquis of Caracena at the behest of Philip III. Geronimo Espinosa evoked the rebellion in the Sierra de la Gar, Pierre Oromig the embarkation at El Grau in Valencia, and with Francesco Peralta, the departures from Alicante and Vinaroz, Los Alfaques, and Vicente Mestre the revolt in Muela de Cortes, the departure from Denia, and the arrival at Oran. All the paintings are accompanied by legends that indicate how many souls embarked at each port in 1609. These figures reveal how the authorities sought to control each step of the expulsion and to achieve their end of a total eradication of the Morisco problem. We do not know how the figures were arrived at, and therefore cannot accept them as accurate, but they do supply one more element toward assessing the details of the departures. If we compare them to the calculation made by Henry Lapierre, based on documents amassed by the Council of State, there is a notable difference between the two, on the order of 30%. The legends of the paintings always give figures that are higher, although not outlandishly so. Therefore, they are worthy of our attention. We must assume that the results of Henry Lapierre's research offer firmer guarantees. They agree with our information about the total population of the Kingdom of Valencia at the beginning of the 17th century, and have been confirmed by later studies. Federico Udina and Ernest Berenguer were able to provide, from a document not known to Lapierre, a specific assessment of the embarkations at Denia. They propose a figure of 42,518 persons expelled, rather than the French historians' 47,144. And Manuel Lomas has made a recent synthesis of findings. Lapierre himself, however, always acknowledged that his calculations could be slightly inaccurate. The second stage of the process affected, logically, the Moriscos of Andalusia, Murcia, and Hornacos in Extremadura. Logically, because these areas included important communities such as that of Seville, with its 7,500 individuals, and because many members lived fairly near the Mediterranean and Atlantic coasts facing North Africa. The case of Hornachos illustrates particularly well the concerns of the king and his councillors. Hornachos was a town whose population of some 4,500 was almost exclusively Morisco, and had the reputation of being impossible to subjugate. The decree was signed by Philip III on 9 December 1609, and proclaimed in Seville on 17 January 1610, and in Murcia the following day. It applied to all Moriscos with the exception of slaves. The document takes pains to stress the danger represented by men and women, who were constantly conspiring. The Moriscos were given 30 days in which to depart. The exiles headed for the ports of Seville, Malaga, or Cartagena, depending on the location of their homes. On 27 January, most of those from western Andalusia and Hornachos left Seville. Those of Jaén, Granada, and southern Cordoba left from Malaga, and those of Murcia from Cartagena. We know that the Moriscos of the village of Priego, in Cordoba, walked the 80 kilometers to Malaga in 4 days, with stops in Iznajar, Archidona, and Casabermeja. The ones from Montella took 5 days to walk the 100 kilometers to Malaga, stopping in Lucena, Bin Ameji, Antequera, and an inn at Almenar. By the end of March, the operation had been completed in Cartagena, and by the end of April in Seville and Malaga. By Henry Lapierre's count, more than 18,000 persons embarked from Seville, about 11,000 from Malaga, and about 6,500 from Cartagena in less than 3 months. In contrast to the situation of the Valencian Moriscos, the new element for these departures was the lack of certainty as to the exile's destination. The decree of 9 December 1609 was silent on the subject. It would have been natural to make a short crossing to the coasts of Morocco or the central Maghreb, and in fact at least some of the 18,000 Moriscos from Seville arrived at Ceuta and Tangier. But great confusion was introduced into Andalusia by debates over the fate of children. These had taken place for the Valencians, but had not affected the actual routes taken. The official in charge of the operation, the Marquis of Saint-Germain, was ordered to require Moriscos to go to Christian countries if they wished to take with them any children younger than 7. All the documents agree. Lapierre established, based on a manuscript from the Biblioteca Nacional in Madrid, a list of 37 ships that carried almost 10,000 passengers from Seville to Marseille. We may suppose that, in spite of these instructions, there were numerous cases in which Moriscos bade the ship's captains to alter their courses and disembark on the North African coast. Nonetheless, Pierre Santoni has found documentary evidence that many ships from Seville, Malaga, and Cartagena docked at Marseille during March and April of 1610. The Andalusian and Murcian Moriscos, who had landed in France, would soon encounter many of their brethren from Castile, who had crossed the Pyrenees between February and April of 1610. These came from Toledo, Ocania, Madrid, Alcalá de Henares, Guadalajara, Pastrana, Segovia, Valladolid, and other points of origin, and had been set in motion by the warrant of 28 December 1609. This was not a decree of expulsion like the earlier ones that applied to the Moriscos of Valencia, Andalusia, Murcia, and Hornachos. The last of these dated from 9 December, only 19 days prior to the warrant that applied to Castile, specifically according to its text to Old and New Castile, Extremadura, and La Mancha. We still do not fully understand why this unusual measure was taken, but we can mention 2 factors. First, if the Crown intended to expel all the Moriscos, it took its time in order to avoid complications and to adapt to all possible circumstances. Second, the 28 December warrant meant that the operations of the Moriscos' banishment could continue, yet they could be prevented from massing on the Mediterranean coasts. The motive was perhaps a fear of revolt, perhaps a lack of resources. Its pretext was the alarm felt by the Castilian Moriscos who, on learning the fate of their co-religionists in Valencia, had become convinced that their hour would come as well and had begun to sell their belongings in preparation for the journey. As Cervantes has the Morisco Ricote say in Don Quixote, Part 2, Chapter 54, I saw clearly, as did all our elders, that those proclamations were not mere threats, as some were saying, but real laws that would be put into effect at the appointed time. The text of the decree was a model of propagandistic structure, since it insisted on the monarch's benevolence in allowing the Moriscos to dispose of their personal property and livestock. In fact, what it set forth in 20 lines had already been expressed in 3 lines in the expulsion edict of the Andalusians. There were 2 original provisions, one placed in an addendum at a later date and the other implicit. The first was the prohibition of traveling via Andalusia, or the kingdoms of Granada, Murcia, Valencia, or Aragon, because exiting to Portugal was unthinkable at that period when the two crowns were united. The only remaining option was to leave for France. The second was the choice offered to these subjects between going into exile or remaining. Let no one live in my realms against his will. This warrant closely resembles those of the conversion and expulsion of the Mudéjars issued in 1502 in Castile and 1525 in Aragon, even in its limitation to departures via the northern regions of the Iberian Peninsula. Therefore, a large number of Castilian Moriscos set off toward the Pyrenees. They were under observation along the way, particularly in Burgos where, according to the Count of Salazar, who was in charge of the operation, nearly 17,000 persons were counted. The great majority of them, after entering France at Hendaye, crossed the south of the country to reach a port in Languedoc or Provence. The flow ceased in late April of 1610, when Philip III decided to close the French frontier through fear of collusion between Frenchmen and Moriscos. The warrant was not entirely respected, however, by the authorities themselves. The closing of the frontier with France in April 1610 required an alternate solution for those Moriscos who planned to leave but were still in Castile. These were mostly from La Mancha and Extremadura. It was decided to return to the port of Cartagena, which was now free after the departure on 22nd March of the last Moriscos from Murcia. Documentation of this phase is scarce, but the chronicler Francesco Casales, who is usually to be trusted, speaks of 15,189 embarkations between 22nd April 1610 and 16th August 1611. This long period presents several problems because it is hard to distinguish voluntary exile, resulting from the order of 28 January 1610, from the expulsions that resulted from the decree of 10 July of the same year. The latter ordered the exile from Old and New Castile, Extremadura, and La Mancha of all the Granadine, Valencian, and Aragonese Moriscos, men, women, and children. A few categories that we will return to later were explicitly exempted, but not the Mudéjares antiguos, those who had lived in Castile since the Middle Ages. The situation of this group was ambiguous, whereas their Granada neighbors, descendants of the exiles from the Kingdom of Granada in 1569 and 1570, were forced to leave, as well as Valencian and Aragonese refugees in Castile. Nonetheless, George Gil Herrera's study of unpublished documents make it possible to resolve many doubts. He has determined that of the 65,745,102 maravedis seized from Castilian Moriscos in Cartagena, 57,764,997, or nearly 88% of the total, had been possessed by those who arrived before the expulsion decree of 10 July 1610. Therefore, few of them would have embarked after that date. A month and a half earlier, on 29 May, the decrees expelling the Catalan and Aragonese Moriscos had been signed. The two documents had a broadly similar structure, but differed in a good many details. The Catalan decree required that the Moriscos take ship at Los Alfagues near Tortosa, the same port from which the Moriscos from northern Valencia had embarked a few months before. But no port was named for the Aragonese group. The expulsion of the Catalan Moriscos began in June 1610. First those from the Lerida region, together with Aragonese from Fraga and Mequinenza, and then those from the Tortosa area, which are Asco, Benissanit, and Miravet. In September, a third contingent also left from Los Alfaques. The number of Catalan Moriscos expelled must have approached 4,000. A good number headed for Oran, but others were taken to Marseille and the Tuscan city of Livorno, and in fact we find Moriscos from Benissanit and Miravet in Provence in early 1611. The Aragonese from Caspe, Samper de Calenda, Hijar, and Uria de Hijar, more than 3,000 in all, arrived at Los Alfaques at the end of June and embarked for Oran on 3rd July. The last to set out for the port were the 3,000 from Zia de Albarracin, who were at Los Alfaques by 26 or 27 July. The embarkations were concluded on 16 September. According to Manuel Lomas's calculation, 41,952 Moriscos from 75 points in Aragon and Catalonia left by this route. Almost all of them were conveyed in private ships, making it difficult to learn their exact destinations. In principle, the majority should have arrived in the region of Oran, but we know of dockings at Marseille and Livorno, as we have mentioned, and also at Tunis and Tetuan. While the embarkations at Los Alfaques were being organized, the Marquis of Aitona, Viceroy of Aragon, decided to expedite the expulsions by directing groups of Moriscos to France, having them pass through Jaca and cross the border at Somport. Moriscos from Aragon's border with Castile, between Tarazona and Borja, followed the same path in the second half of June 1610, but the Duke of La Force, governor of Bearn, wishing to stem the Morisco tide, prevented them from entering. The columns were forced to turn back and go to Los Alfaques after all. After a difficult negotiation between the French and the Spaniards, some contingents were allowed to pass on condition of paying a toll. Almost 12,000 individuals crossed the frontier at Canfranc during the second half of August and the first days of September. By 4th September, all was concluded. Other groups of Aragonese Moriscos from the Catalayud area, from Brea in the north to Terrace in the south, about 10,000 souls, took the long road through Navarre, crossing the passes at Vera or Barguet in order to enter France. Like the great majority of those who had gone before them, they then tried to reach a port on the Mediterranean, usually Agde in Languedoc. Between September 1609 and September 1610, that is in no more than a year, the Catholic monarchy had attained its objective, to exile the immense majority of the Moriscos through expulsion by sectors, Valencians, Andalusians, Murcians, and residents of Hornachos, Catalans and Aragonese, or by pseudo-expulsion of the Castilians. The infinite difficulties of applying a measure decided only on 4 April 1609 should not let us forget that after a single year of often chaotic operations, about 90% of the Moriscos no longer lived in Spain. Many recent studies have focused on the individuals or groups who managed to escape expulsion, those called vueltos y caídos, which means returnees and remainers in the documents. But in spite of the interest of these individual cases, the reality of a massive exile is unquestionable. Henry Lapierre sums up this reality with the following table: 116,000 Valencian Moriscos, 30,000 Andalusians, 6,000 Murcians, 17,000 Castilians via France, 10,000 to 15,000 Castilians via Cartagena, 64,000 Catalans and Aragonese. Total 243,000 to 248,000 persons. Lapierre titles his last chapter Culmination, or rather Accomplishment, viz. of the expulsion in the Castilian kingdom, which took place from 1611 to 1614. In my opinion, based on his own study, we can mark the moment of accomplishment as September 1610, counting from the putting into effect of the Castilians' expulsion decree of 10 July of that year. There is an enormous difference between the 243,000 expelled in that 1 year and the at most 29,000 exiled in the following 4 years. If the figure of 243,000 expelled in a year attests to the efficacy of the methods used, it highlights even more a determination to eradicate the Morisco population in the face of all possible obstacles. But it is not so easy to explain the small size of the second number, 29,000. Was it the result of an administration worn out by so many efforts and complications, or of the ability of the Moriscos and their protectors to oppose the authorities' plans, or even of the limited number of Moriscos who were left after the summer of 1610? There was further legislation adopted between 1611 and 1614, particularly 3 orders to expel Moriscos who had remained or had returned. These were issued on 22nd March 1610, 19 September 1612, and 16 October 1613, while decrees directed to the Moriscos of the Ricote Valley were promulgated on 8 October 1611 and 9 October 1613. All these showed that the goal was to let no one remain in Spain without official consent. But these groups of Moriscos were smaller all the time, generally made up of very assimilated individuals who did not pose any threat and who often enjoyed the protection of influential parties, that are bishops, landed gentry, city councils, or fellow citizens. The geography of the lengthy final phase has particular features. From the summer of 1610 onward, the expulsion affected scattered towns in the Kingdom of Castile. The inhabitants of La Algaba, near Seville, left from Sanlúcar de Barrameda in September 1611 and arrived in Marseille on 8 October. From 2 towns in Extremadura, the Moriscos of Madaquera embarked at Malaga, and those of Pencarencia at Cartagena in the summer of 1611. From the areas of Segovia, Toledo, and the Campo de Calatrava, many Mudéjar Anticos were among those who crossed to France in the course of 1611. But insistence by the Council of State had begun to lose its force. The decree of 8 October 1611, designed to expel the Mudéjares Anticos of the Kingdom of Murcia via Cartagena, had hardly any effect. The permitted exceptions for slaves and for Moriscos who lived among Old Christians, and support from local authorities, made it easy to find a way to remain. After a lengthy study of the situation and an internal debate, the Council of State issued a new expulsion decree 2 years later, on 19 October 1613, as a result of which thousands of Mudéjares Anticos from the Ricote Valley and other Murcian towns departed from Cartagena in December 1613 and January 1614. The Council of State then determined that as of 20th February, the expulsion of the Moriscos from Spain was at an end. Morisco Geography after the expulsion from Spain. The next question to consider is that of the final destination of all these exiles. But before answering it, we must recall how many unexpected turns their journeys took. Insufficient attention has been paid to the Moriscos' itineraries after they embarked at a Spanish port or crossed the French frontier. Their exile was an odyssey full of surprises, misfortunes, and challenges. Many arrived late at their destinations, because some had left planning to return. Others followed a route different from that of their families, whom they hoped to rejoin. A number were set ashore in unwanted locations. More fled from attacks by natives of their landing places, and many died. An important and still little studied aspect was the passage of groups of exiles through Christian countries, France and Italy. We have seen how many Moriscos crossed the frontier through the Pyrenees, and how many ships set sail for Marseille or Livorno, though we cannot know which ones actually arrived there. Therefore, it is very difficult to make estimates, but recent studies of the Moriscos' arrival in France makes it possible to advance some well-founded proposals. Over 30 years ago, Antonio Dominguez Ortiz and I guessed at a number of more than 30,000 Moriscos who had entered France. Today this estimate seems to me to be extremely low. It should be revised in light of the figures given by Manuel Lomas in his book about the expulsions from Aragon, and his PhD thesis about Moriscos who took the overland route. His numbers confirm in general those established by Henri Lapierre and those gathered by Pierre Santoni regarding movement through the ports of Marseille and Toulon. Santoni affirms that considering the large number of Moriscos who passed through Languedoc before reaching Provence, the latter province must have received 50,000 or 60,000 of them. I consider this number valid because some arrived at Marseille, Aix-en-Provence, La Ciotat, Cassis, Toulon, etc., after many days of travelling on foot, while others came by sea from Seville, Malaga, Motril, Cartagena, Valencia, and Los Alfaques, or even from Agde, a port in Languedoc. The many provincial documents are rich in references to the exiles' place of origin: Andújar, Baeza, La Algaba, Seville, the Campo de Montiel, Villanueva de los Infantes, Malen, Cuarte, Benissanet, Miravet. In short, from Andalusia and La Mancha, Aragon and Catalonia. These details about Grenadines, first exiled in Castile, and Aragonese underscore the breadth of Morisco settlement in Spain. Even the Kingdom of Valencia is registered in a document from Marseille, with a single reference to a ship that came from its capital city in October 1610. And if we accept Pierre Santoni's figure of 50,000 to 60,000 Moriscos who arrived in Provence, we should remember that not all of those who entered France made their way to that region. Many others chose Agde, the port in Languedoc, from which they would try to board a ship to North Africa. Some went to other parts of France, especially the southwest, where they were welcomed by Moriscos who had settled there even before the expulsion decree. These were not many, probably only a few thousand, because France undertook its own expulsion measures on both a national level, on 15 April 1610, and a regional one in Provence on 3 December. Italy's case is fairly similar to that of France, but little is known about how many individuals were affected. Traces are found in the documents of dockings at Livorno, as we have noted, and also at Genoa and at the small port of Civitavecchia near Rome. It is possible that small groups of Moriscos remained in Italy, but the great majority, just as in France, would have planned to undertake a further voyage. The passage of tens of thousands of Moriscos through France and Italy had great repercussions on the definitive geography of their exile. In principle, their final destinations should have depended on two factors: proximity, not only geographic, but also in culture and religion, represented by Islam for the vast majority, and attractividad, which means attraction. How they would be welcomed, both by the local rulers and by any relatives already established in the area. On this basis, it would be logical to head from the Algerian or Moroccan regions, and we have seen that the first wave of exiles, the Valencians, disembarked near Oran. From there many went on to settle in the area between Tlemcen and Mustaghanim, but others tried to go farther east toward Algiers, while a number headed toward Morocco. On the same principle, the Andalusian and Extremaduran Moriscos preferred nearby Morocco with its ports at Tangier, Ceuta, and Al Hoceima. They tended to settle either in Tetuan, where many Muslims from Al-Andalus were already living, or in Rabat Saleh, where the Moriscos, especially those from Hornachos, were becoming famous for their activity as courtiers and their ability to preserve their autonomy over a period of decades. The accidents of the expulsion opened up other options, particularly in Tunis. The violent assaults suffered by Moriscos around Oran were widely noticed and inspired others to find alternatives. The roundabout routes through France and Italy were expensive. From ports like Agde, and especially from Marseille, Toulon, and Livorno, the distance to Tunis was even shorter. Doubts remained about the final destination, among other reasons, because Algiers was the most important and cosmopolitan city of the entire Maghreb, and especially because it had received many Moriscos throughout the 16th century. Algiers was the longed-for ideal, if we are to believe, for example, a letter from the Licenciate Molina, a Morisco from Trujillo, dated 25th April 1611. According to him, his co-religionist neighbors had gone to Algiers, where most of those from Extremadura, La Mancha, and Aragon are to be found. He and his companions had embarked at Cartagena, probably in April 1610, and had landed at Marseille, but the problems they encountered in Provence led them to continue on to Livorno and from there to Algiers. Other large contingents settled in that city, home to the Barbaroja brothers, and in its environs from Blida to Alcoria. In contrast to Algiers, Tetuan, and Fez, Tunis did not harbor a large Morisco community before the expulsion, but recent studies, particularly those of Louis Bernabe Pons, have highlighted how many wealthy Moriscos from Granada exiled themselves voluntarily, convinced that their nation would be inevitably expelled. They preferred to take the initiative so as to organize their new lives as well as possible. Two of them, for instance, were the original leaders, or seis, of the Andalusis in Tunis, Luis Zapata and Mustafa de Cardenas. It is likely that both of them had passed through France, and there met with other Moriscos exiled to Toulouse or Marseille, like El Chapis from Granada and the famous Aragonese Alonso Lopez, the procurator, which means representative of the Moriscos in France. Zapata and Cardenas were probably drawn to Tunis by Uthman Dey, who realized the economic benefit that his regency could reap from Morisco settlement. Thus a current was established that swelled to huge proportions in the following years. The local French consulate documented a good number of Moriscos who were engaged in trade in Tunis. These were divided into two principal groups. On the one hand, northerners or Aragonese, and on the other those of Granadan origin who had arrived from many cities in Castile, Alcalá de Henares, Madrid, Toledo, Salamanca, Valladolid, Murcia, Ubeda, Cazorla, and Granada. There were very few Valencians. We can trace the broad outlines of Morisco geography subsequent to the expulsion from Spain. The Maghreb as a whole was the greatest receiving area. How many Moriscos eventually settled along the southern coast of the Mediterranean? The paucity of information makes it risky to offer firm numbers, but I believe that routes and destinations can be reconstructed on the basis of the names of exiles, whose origin is known. Those given here are a mere sample, since an actual count is impossible. We must rely on the available data as interpreted by common sense. Miquel de Epalza's estimates were of some 80,000 who settled in Morocco, 116,000 who landed in the vicinity of Algiers between October and December 1609, plus others who came later, and another 80,000 in Tunis. The total comes to well over 256,000. If we consider the thousands who decided to go to Eastern Mediterranean ports, especially to Istanbul, where the Ottoman Sultan protected them, and the thousands more who sought new lives in France and Italy, we arrive at figures greater than Epalza's, although he himself believed that he had underestimated their numbers. Miquel de Epalza's calculations have the virtue of being consistent. They are adapted to estimates of departures from Spain, which are based on solid research. I assume that the figure of 116,000 for Algeria corresponds to the 116,000 Valencian Moriscos who were expelled, according to Lapierre's calculations. These estimates also agree with our knowledge of the different stages of the expulsion and their intended destinations. In this regard, we should note that the latest findings about the passage of waves of Moriscos through France and the later crossing of most of them to Tunis tend to confirm the possibility that the latter regency received about 80,000. The equal number assigned to Morocco also seems plausible, although we cannot verify it at present. The least secure figure is the one for Algeria. Epalza's 116,000 seems inflated to me. Like all the others, it rests on three debatable premises: that no one died during the crossings. This holds true for all the other destinations as well: that all the Moriscos from Valencia landed on the Algerian coast, and that once disembarked, all of them stayed in Algeria. We cannot ignore the possibility that at least some of them ended up sooner or later in Morocco. In the opposite case, we would need to add to those Valencian Moriscos others from Aragon or Granada, Castile, who were expelled in 1610 or 1611. I would like to offer two tentative conclusions based on these speculations. First, that Epalza's estimates are too high. To accept them, we would have to revise upward the number of Moriscos living in Spain on the eve of the expulsion, as well as the number of those expelled. For example, for the Valencian Moriscos, we would have to credit not Lapierre's figures, but those offered by the paintings made in 1612 and 1613, and nothing justifies doing so. Second, that the Moriscos were fairly evenly distributed among the three Maghrebi lands of Morocco, Tunis, and Algeria, with a somewhat larger presence in the last of these. It will be essential to confirm that situation through future research. The question of whether the Moriscos remained in exile or returned to Spain is an equally difficult one. We have already seen the status of the vueltos y quedados was of a profound concern to the monarchy. 3 royal decrees of 1611, 1612, and 1613 attest to the fact. Several historians have studied the issue closely in recent years. For Trevor J. Dadson, the example of Villarrubia de los Ojos, one of the 5 Campo de Calatrava towns, was a model that can be extended to many Morisco areas of Spain. But it is based on a very low figure. Some 600 Mudejares Antigos who, according to him, either never left home or managed to return. We are on firm ground in disagreeing with the author, for whom all of those individuals avoided being expelled. But even if we admitted that the whole population of Villarrubia de los Ojos and all the Mudejares Antigos of La Mancha either remained or returned, that would add up to 4,000 or 5,000 persons, and we recall that their number in 1502 was estimated at only around 2,000. In the kingdom of Murcia, the Mudejares Antigos were among the largest groups of their kind in Spain. According to a report by the Dominican Juan de Pereda, in 1612 they numbered 8,351. Most of them were expelled in 1614, but some escaped and a good number returned, although we are unable to provide exact figures. In any case, it is risky to generalize on the basis of the two main centers, for those remaining and those returned, the 5 towns of the Campo de Calatrava and the Ricote Valley in the kingdom of Murcia. The Mudejares Antigos of Extremadura, at least those from their 3 principal towns of Hornachos, Bencarencia, and Magasela, were expelled, and we find no trace of returnees. And in Avila, the city that housed the largest urban concentration of Moriscos in Old Castile, around 400 families or 1,600 individuals between Mudejares Antigos and more recent arrivals from Granada, only about 25 families, of which 13 were Mudejares Antigos, managed to stay. Within Aragon, the term Mudejares Antigos was not in use, but the Catalan Moriscos, who did not enjoy the privileges granted to Mudejares Antigos in Castile, resembled in many ways, at least in 1610, the Mudejares Antigos from the Campo de Calatrava and the Ricote Valley. They lived chiefly in 13 towns of the Ribera de Ebro regions of Tortosa. The majority of them were considered good Christians who deserved not to be expelled. Such was the opinion of the Bishop of Tortosa, Pedro Manrique. We can accept that about half of the 800 Morisco residents of this region avoided the expulsion, most of them with official permission, a few clandestinely. To them may be added a number of returnees that is difficult to establish. We find that some natives of Ascó, Benissanet, and Miravet, the 3 local towns most affected by the expulsion, were in Provence in early 1611, but back in their hometowns or others in the area by 1612 or 1613. I believe that the Campo de Calatrava, the Ricote Valley, and other towns in Murcia and Ribera de Ebro were the 3 areas where exemptions from the expulsions were granted on a large scale. I may be leaving out an occasional town, for example, Alcantara and Valencia de Alcantara, which had fewer than 1,000 Moriscos between them. But it would be surprising if a group of any size had escaped the notice of both the authorities in 1609 to 1614, so determined to leave nothing to chance, and the historians who have devoted so much time since the 1950s to studying the Moriscos. We should remember that the 3 geographical areas highlighted here were clearly identified by Henry Lapierre in his Géographie de l'Espagne Morisque in 1959, and also by Dominguez Ortiz and myself in our Historia de los Moriscos, Vida y Tragedia de una Minoria, published in 1978, with a final chapter on the Morisco presence in Spain after the expulsion. To repeat, we are speaking of 4,000 to 5,000 Mudejares Antigos in La Mancha, aside from the Campo de Calatrava nucleus, about 8,000 in the Kingdom of Murcia, and between 3,000 and 3,500 Moriscos in Ribera de Ebro. The total in 1610 would have been 15,000 or 16,000 Moriscos, of whom a large percentage remained or returned. A relatively high number of Valencian Moriscos, Aragonese, Grenadins, children, slaves, spouses of old Christians, and other persons who were held to be good Christians, would have enjoyed the same outcome. But let us understand the concept of a relatively high number, Members of these categories lived everywhere, probably much more often in Castile than in Aragon. At the last minute, there was a wave of mixed marriages and deliberate enslavements intended to avoid exile. Various strategies proved to work. There was also a growing number of lawsuits by Moriscos, who claimed to belong to one of the exempted categories. But even though this movement was widespread geographically and certainly demands our attention, it affected only a small slice of the Morisco world. Several studies have established that mixed marriages were few. In Aragon and Catalonia, slavery was limited. But in Andalusia, many efforts were made to allow slaves to remain, and Moriscos were clearly doing everything possible to avoid abandoning their young children. In the absence of precise figures, we are obliged to use our common sense. Similarly, the number of returnees, like that of those who remained clandestinely, could not be very large. Moriscos were occasionally helped by old Christians, but they were also in danger of being denounced at any moment. This is precisely the subject of the dialogue between Sancho and Ricote in Don Quixote. The Quidados could not have totaled more than a few tens of thousands, to the maximum number of 15,000 from La Mancha, Murcia, and Ribera de Ebro. We might add just a few scattered individuals. And the Vueltos must have been only a few thousand. All in all, both groups could have numbered between 10% and 15% of the whole Morisco population that had been present in Spain at the dawn of the 17th century. This proportion is not negligible, and it should inspire more research into how these persons eventually assimilated. But their presence should not hide the fact that by the end of a lengthy process, the monarchy had achieved its goal of putting an end to the Morisco problem, as many contemporaries expressed it, through the expulsion, something it had been unable to do in a century through its former policy of evangelization. The end.